Good morning, everyone. Those who came because of the call, I'd like to say thank you very much for making time for this very important talk on a weird morning. As in, we don't normally have such talks, but because Neelika Jayawardane was in town on Omar Badsha's project, we thought we could try, convince her to come through. But fortunately, it didn't take much of convincing because she loves the space, she loves what we do, and she volunteered to come through to just talk to us about the work. A little bit about Neelika. She's Associate Professor of English at State University of New York-Oswego, and a Senior Editor and Contributor to the online magazine Africa is a Country. And probably most of you guys, if not all of you, know about it. Yeah? So, let's welcome her, and hopefully you guys prepared some questions for her and a bit of engagement. Thank you very much. And I guess we can go about my name is Neelika, for those who don't know me.
Thank you so much for coming. I know that back when I was a student, there were so many mandatory lectures that I had to go to. Now you're in my shoes, so I understand how you feel, and I'll try to keep it as interesting and short as possible and leave lots of time for questions. Can you hear me pretty well? Okay. If I drop the mic or something, make some kind of signal at me, and I'll try to project my voice. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about was Omar Badsha's work. I knew him as the guy who ran South African History Online. I knew he was a photographer, but his work was really not available anywhere. And I'd never see it like the way I would see some of the famous photographers' work. Whenever I come to South Africa, you see these people's work anywhere and everywhere, or in journals that use the stock photograph all the time. So the first time that I encountered Omar Badsha's work was at the International Center for Photography in New York in December in 2012 at the rise and fall of apartheid photography and the bureaucracy of everyday life. And there, in a display case, was this treasure, a letter to Fazana, published in 1979 in commemoration of the United Nations International Year of the Child. However, I couldn't open this book and look inside because they had put it in a museum case. So it was this sort of tempting and tantalizing thing, and I was really curious about this image and what it might hold, but nothing in the museum's case told me what was inside. So I thought, okay, it's called Letter to Fazana. I imagine that's to a lover, a child. Who could it be? And what's inside it? When I came to South Africa the following year, I tried to search him out. And I found that it contained 67 images and 27 newspaper articles describing the lives of both black and white South African children. Badsha collected this to serve as a record of the country into which his first daughter, Fazana, was born. So it had nothing to do with all the things I imagined, in fact. The cover consists of this photograph of his Tadeshkawa-born grandmother with her newborn great-granddaughter in her arms. The actual photograph, when I looked at it, was beyond anything I could imagine. I had this immediate understanding of her face and her body, which are curved in a sickle moon in their expression of love. The brightness from a window behind her, setting alight the hope she has had for this fourth generation of South Africans of Gujarati ancestry. Omar told me later that she belongs to a particular group called the Nakuda, and they're the descendants of sea captains and navigators who traveled from Surat in the western coast of India to Aden on the Arabian Peninsula and all of the east coast of Africa. And that her, who came from this ancestry of migration and displacement and constant movement, must have had great hopes for her granddaughter that she would find a place to be once and for all, 4 generations after the historical moment into which she was born. Yet it's also, if you know Omar, like he shouts at people, It's a finger-wagging exhortation to not collapse under hopelessness, but to raise up her fist and do something. Since that first experience with Badsha's photographs, I learned that he's known for having fashioned a new visual vocabulary for translating the lives of those that apartheid excluded out of South Africa's consciousness. Often the public whom he photographed may not have even realized that they were excised into the periphery of the nation's vision of itself, nor have had the luxury of imagining themselves as part of the national narrative. Like others who became conscientized under the influence of the Black consciousness movement, led by Steve Biko, Badsha came to identify himself as Black without losing his understanding of what it meant to be part of a Gujarati Muslim trading community. He became seminal to the development of the vocabulary of critical resistance photography, or what he calls also social resistance photography. It's photography that broadly operates within the category of struggle photography, reporting on the injustices of apartheid. Together with his passion for organizing and union work, he helped make photography a strategy for intervention, intervention in how the South African struggle against apartheid was seen by a global public, and also by a national public. At the core of Badsha's work is his tenacious grip on political integrity, and on directing the aesthetic, intellectual, and educative focus of his photographic projects. Yet perhaps because Badsha's interest was in collective organizing and not on personal fame, his own work remains not as well recognized as that of others. Badsha's camera is not known for focusing on great beauties or scenic vistas meant to evoke sublime pleasure. His eye, sharp and contentious as his tongue is known to be, cuts through the cultural baggage that trains us to look at the beautiful and the acceptably pretty. But I find that when I'm undistracted by prettiness or convention, I see something else instead. When I look at Badsha's image of a garment worker standing in the hollow of darkness, in this hollow of darkness, her elbows are leaning on piles of cardboard boxes. Her fingers are intertwined and resting against her face in a gesture that I always associate with prayer. We see this woman's exhaustion, her despair, her supplication to a God who may be one of the few assurances in her life. Her body is tempted by a shapeless uniform meant to fit the masses, and a long apron is fitted around the lower half of her body. Her hair is covered with a cotton dirk, and it is the only thing that on her uniform body and her apron body that's decorative. It's the only one about which she has a choice. You can see a pattern of flowers peeking through these folds. But mostly her face is obscured by the hands that sit just above her fine, small nose and her right thumb stretched out to cradle her lower lip and cheek. Her lower face and the shape of her jaw are lost to the black shadows around her. But she and the boxes from the garment factory, those objects on which her livelihood depends, are bathed in an otherworldly light. Perhaps she's working the night shift, and the source of light is from a fluorescent light. But here, in this moment, she's God's own child in communion with the divine. Though Badsha's work has been instrumental an instrumental part of 2 books of photography meant to document apartheid conditions and build support abroad. Notably, I don't know if you know these books, Second Carnegie Commission on Poverty and Development sponsored. There's a book called South Africa, the Cordoned Heart, and Beyond the Barricades, Popular Resistance of South Africa. In the US, you can get these on Amazon quite cheaply, and I immediately went and snapped up a couple, and I transported them across the Atlantic Ocean for my friends. And my luggage was overweight, but I had to beg somebody. And then, so these books really fashioned a new visual vocabulary for communicating the story of South Africa to the global public. He can also claim these 2 books of photography bearing solely his name, Letter to Fozana, which you saw already, and this one, photographic essay on forced removals in South Africa, which was published in 1984, documenting life in the massive informal settlements in the Inanda area in Durban, where he worked as a political activist. And though he is the go-to person that many international scholars, including me, and curators seek out when looking for information about the history of political documentary and photography, he's still not one of the big names with which South African photography is associated internationally or even nationally. The reasons may be obvious. Few commercial galleries were open to exhibiting the works of black photographers, and no agents came forward to promote black photographers' work unless it had commercial appeal or in fact reinforced the stereotypes that apartheid and white supremacy in general supported. Badsha refused to exhibit in segregated studios and state-sponsored shows, marginalizing him already as a difficult character who didn't play the game of supplication properly. Now, you know, I grew up with a Palestinian Iraqi woman who became a photographer, right? And the same story is true for her. Like she's now working in Ramallah, where her grandmother was born at one time, and there are refugees, of course. And she says the same things. Like she says that part of Palestinian solidarity is that even when the show says, "Oh, we're trying to bring, you know, Jewish and Palestinian photographers together," if the state is sponsoring it, it's with an agenda, you know. So she says there's lots of opportunities you miss, but if you play that game, you also lose your kind of political dignity. And I think, you know, when I hear Badsha's stories, they're very similar. Around the late 60s and 70s, unless black photographers took a specific kind of photograph documenting spectacular violence, press agencies didn't come calling either. In response to these disparities, in 1982, Badsha and a collective of photographers founded Afropix, an independent photographic agency that not only helped promote black photographers on the international circuit, but played a significant role in influencing South Africa's political climate during the 80s and shaped the tropes of social documentary photography in the country. Do you all know about Afropix? Yeah, right? Black life and Africa, you know, in quotes, this idea of Africa in general. I want to focus attention to that long history of photographing Africa and the imaginary, cultural imaginary built by Europe. These images from the past still shape our own image repertoire of what we expect of blackness and of this idea of Africa, right? And any of you who know us from our blog called Africa as a Country, most of it, you know, we started because we were so annoyed by the way that CNN or BBC reported what we knew our lives to be, and they were very different from the way CNN and the BBC reported us. And so I want to go a little bit background and talk about I don't know, have you seen these kind of colonial portraits of what an African is, and they continue to be on the postcard, like when you go to Tanzania or Kenya, whatever, right? Like that's the African they want. They don't want the city person shopping at ShopRite. And in fact, yesterday, I was doing this, side note, right? I was doing stupid bureaucracy at BITS, right, to get a security card and blah, blah, blah. So the lovely, lovely elderly woman was wearing a necklace that I knew immediately, it's from Kenya, from this part that I've gone, and I know this necklace and the style of it, right? So I said, where did you get this necklace? Was it at a market here? And it's also from a time, you know, because our tropes changes, like Africans don't stay the same, and we don't produce the same jewelry. People are modern, and maybe they had, the Maasai or the whatever, Samburu had one kind of jewelry in the 60s, and it changes over time because of influences. So I knew it came from a specific moment, like around the 1990s, which is when I was there as a student, right? Late 1990s. And she said, oh, my son brought it from Africa. And, the sweetest woman, right? So I was thinking, oh my God, there's so much work to be done. And I don't know if the work will ever affect her vision of what it is, you know? And I said, oh, I think it's from Kenya. And, you know, I didn't want to be rude. She's just a nice, lovely old lady. And how are you going to, attack her with all of this, you know, my Africa is a country rhetoric can't attack this lovely old lady. And afterwards I was walking around with the young secretary who was helping me, and I said, did you notice this? And she said, no, you know, the thing is, you guys always notice these things, but we were used to it, so we don't really critically think about these things. And this historian who's very famous, Walter Mignolo, came to visit, and she was taking him around, and he had said something similar. I mean, like, he's like a world-famous historian, and he had said, oh, this doesn't feel like Africa to me. It looks like anywhere in, like, you know, in Europe, it could be whatever. And I was thinking, why isn't, like, Europe isn't like some guy in Lederhosen, you know, eating cheese on a mountain with some goats. Like, if Europeans don't have to remain stuck with that idea of who they are, and a modern city can take place, why isn't Johannesburg our idea of what Africa is, or Nairobi, or whatever, right? And as well as, like, I grew up in the middle of, like, a rural place with crocodiles in the river, so to me that's also home, but this is also very much home, and I'm proud of both of it, right? So, I mean, like, that history of portraiture that cultivated European settlers and European views about that distant other at the tip of Africa still and continues to inform us about the manner in which critical documentary photographers work engaged with those historical references. And we have to, in a way, play with those things and subvert and challenge those photographic tropes that aided the colonial conquest project. The primary goal of colonial era photographs was to record the native and to produce a particular vision of Africans as unidimensional creatures bound by custom, outside the flows of time and development to which Europeans had access. The earliest photographs of the Cape illuminate a world reflected with, in fact, European romanticism and the ethnographic fascinations of the time. Empty, picturesque landscapes, absent of people, or replete with noble natives going about their timeless tasks, like, I don't know, like, you know, herding some cattle. Evident here are the obsessions with photographing the so-called Bantu and the so-called Bushmen in order to group people into types and visually creating a cartography, meaning like making a map of essential characteristics that help the British or the French or the Portuguese in a way, that colonial agenda of constructing others who remain situated in time and place, unavailable to, and in fact, we were supposedly uninterested in the flows of modernity. As Christopher Webster argues, the photograph in its colonial context thus played a powerful role in helping establish taxonomers, giving those colonial taxonomers a language with which they could make sense of that world and place it in a comprehensible European context. But because images related to narratives are often constructed subjectively, points out Webster, colonial photographs were often, and sometimes unwittingly, used to confirm what was already understood by Europeans about Africa rather than become a production of new knowledge. And many of you, you know, you are documentary photographers and you're journalism photographers, right? You're trying to kind of disseminate new information. But sometimes I think people are so informed by those old ideas that they've, and we've really gone without questioning it, that they unwittingly kind of reproduce those same things. And I'm not saying you are, but you know, we see it all the time in fashion photography especially. There's always like some Maasai standing in the back, half naked, and some skinny model wearing something like maybe some beads and then, you know, a $5,000 piece of silk. And that probably, you know, like half-paid Bangladeshi government. And so, I mean, I could go on and on about this photographic archive and how, you know, this people were photographed, but that's very boring and you can always find out later. I think that for me, always that archive reminds me that the visual is not outside, like on the periphery, but they're central to our political self-formation and self-projection in South Africa. Colonial portraiture typically emphasizes the fact that the camera and the photograph, with its complexity of readings, was of European origin. And we're always told, oh, these technologies are European, and the ways in which we are supposed to look are always going to be influenced by that modernity that came from Europe, and that we can't subvert that or challenge that or change that or use it to our own desires. And I think that, of course, I disagree, and I think we can. So these colonial notions about the other, I believe, are often unconsciously subscribed to, either specifically in locations where there have been long histories of reading the body of the other according to received notions of race. That body of images, a century of photographs of South Africans, colonials and the colonized alike, in fact I should say 150, a century and a half that photography has been around, they have an authority over how audiences read themselves. So even though you as photographers may be very savvy, right, and then you're like, no, I want to kind of represent how people have been representing me, or my people, or my friends, or my family. What ends up happening is that the audience will keep seeing what they want because they're informed by that century and a half of stuff. So even if I show my students some, like something very interesting and something very different, they're still like, oh, that's just like, and they're reading it, and I keep thinking, how come, where did that information come from? It is not in that image at all. And so I think that even as we attempt to kind of shift them, you're always aware of the fact that your audiences may not have gone through that critical process that you yourself did. And it becomes a very kind of problematic relationship between you and that audience, and that third party in the relationship that you never invited into that conversation, that image repertoire that's in our head. And so this is not to say, of course, that there's no interstices in which photographers might carve out a space from which they could challenge those colonial and apartheid tropes. And photography does not have to be associated with displacing and fixing the native. In the latter part of the 20th century, photography came to have dual functions, one that confirmed and advanced colonial ethos towards the other. We still have those photos. And then there's the other that sought to question those accepted tropes. On the one hand, photography was actively engaged as a part of violence and as a medium of appropriation, of infringement of the right to privacy of others, of racist and colonial representation. But on the other, it also acted as an instrument that records and represents violence with the hopes of enacting change. So I think that photographers like Omar Badsha, he's always aware that his work must contend with this influential archive. He recognized and works against that complex visual repertoire manufactured by both the colonial era photography, apartheid rhetoric, and the stark binaries of struggle photography as well. He takes these stills we have in our minds, the passive native and the Molotov cocktail throwing revolutionary, the kind of binaries to which blackness is being relegated, and offers instead something that is not only mobile, but transformative, converse to all our received notions of Africa, race, blackness, and apartheid, displacing established notions of the South African self, native and other. And I have some background about Afropix, but I think you all know about why Afropix was founded, right? Like because so few black photographers got hired. And I think in 1982, that's when Paul Weinberg, Sansu Mofokeng got together. Cedric Nunn, that's right. So all these people, they formed this collective, and all their energies went into having sort of a union where they could call people up and say, instead of like foreign journalists flying in, they would be the go-to people, and they could actually give employment to people, and then the way that South Africa was represented would be different too. And so from its initial founding in 1982 to its disbanding in 1990, and I still have to ask him about what happened? Why did you break up? Afropix is a photographic collective dedicated to editorial control of resistance photography and the collaboration of resistance, and that it was founded by these two established activists, or 3 or 4 actually. And so I think that editorial control and having intentional control is really a huge part of what we have to do as people who are both documentarians, artists, and people who want to be employed in the future as well. And what Omar calls it is either social documentary photography or critical documentary photography. And I think, part of their challenge was to in fact challenge the contradictions between the National Party, the Afrikaner National Party's message, and the lived reality of the apartheid state by documenting inherent violence of the system. And they transformed that by I think that, when the foreign news agencies hired somebody or sent somebody, they wanted something like spectacular because that would make the front page. But I think Omar was really interested in, I think Cedric Nunn came here, right? I don't know if he talked about his last project, the one in the Eastern Cape where he photographed basically absence, right? I mean, there's nothing spectacular about it. But what's spectacular is our ignorance of that history. And then suddenly I learned about it because I wrote a chapter for his book that's coming out. And I was like, oh my God, I'm spectacularly ignorant about this history that was instrumental to enormous, enormous change. And it was 100 years. Who doesn't hear about a 100-year war? It would be on every history book if it, was some other war happening in Europe. And so I was like, wow, this absence is what's spectacular, but how does a photographer write absence? Or a writer write a story that's not being told, or it's just suppressed. And so I think, their challenge was to photograph something that's not spectacular or even present. I think that's a remarkable thing, to photograph something that's completely absent from our cultural memory. And there's very few leftover signals that would even lead you to prove that this thing happened and changed an entire region's history. And so their work helped reframe the story of South Africa and was instrumental to reshaping the ways in which we ourselves saw each other as Southern Africans. And this powerful message of the apartheid state was in a way subverted by that. And so I don't want to go into these details, but I want to I want to show you some images that from Omar's work. And this one, I think Badsha sought to reveal the extraordinary lengths to which the apartheid state went in order to dispossess black South Africans of land and ability to make a viable living. So instead of going out on the street and photographing a clash, he went to these ghettos where people were moved, and there's this massive place outside. Is anybody from Durban? Yeah, so this place, right, that he photographed. It's still there. It's still there. It's not that it went away, And this is of a young girl who is repairing her house, and she's in an ancient hand-me-down dress, and this flowery pattern adds a little bit of pleasure to her impossible task. Is carrying these small lumps of mud of plaster to paper the walls of her house. Her face and arms are smeared in mud. She balances this ball of mud on her head with her small arms and hands reaching up, steadying herself and the mud on her head. Her expression is that of a Sisyphean warrior, resigned, methodical, carrying on with her balancing act with as much dignity as possible. And when I see a picture, I see there's so many women whose labor, and so many children whose labor I see every day, just carrying on with their labor. And you don't even imagine a day that this labor will be over, because you just resign to the fact that I have to do this. And there's what he got was that not despair as much as just a resignedness. You're just resigned to doing this labor. And for most of us, like for me, life is only possible because I always think of tomorrow I have this ambitious thing, and tomorrow I'll have this ambitious thing to get out of this one, and third day I have another thing, I always have a future that I'm dreaming of, and I have maybe access to, and an escape plan, or whatever, I have dreaming that allows me to deal with mundane duties, you all have projects that you're sick of, but you're just tomorrow I do this. And that dreaming is not in her life. And so I was so moved by the fact that he was able to get that. How does somebody live without dreaming? And the inherent violence of not having dreaming being part of your life. And among his images are also pictures of schools that, despite that kind of violence, there's a school teacher who has, I don't know how many students were in her class, but it was a huge class, and yet she still was motivated and she still wanted to teach that class. I think if you've seen Ernest Cole, he also did these kinds of photographs of children who are in these tiny schoolrooms. They're totally cracked and they're bending down on the ground writing, and there's one image of Cole's where the child, sweat is falling down his face because it's so hot, but he's so, engaged in the act of figuring something out or writing. And you see that it's not that kind of colonial story about the native doesn't want, the native isn't interested, the native is not intelligent. It cannot still remain in your head when you see that child with sweat pouring down his face, sitting on a mud floor writing, I saw Cole's images recently at another show in New York, and so it's amazing what he also did. And so he has these pictures of children teaching each other, reading from the Bible, and he said sometimes that's the only book they had. And the other thing that I think he also shows in this particular book is that forced removals recognize no difference between Indian, Zulu, Muslim, Hindu, and Christian, and that the alliances forged in the poorest and most marginalized of ghettos of apartheid South Africa may be as powerful and transgressive as some of those at the highest echelons of the resistance movement. Because I grew up in Zambia, we were so aware of the fact that this, high-level ANC stuff was happening, but I never heard about what might be happening at the lowest, those who didn't have even those resources. And so he has these pictures of this very elderly grandmother and her grandchild, and then a similar kind of mirror photograph of and these are really rubbish photos, by the way, because Omar is disorganized, I have to say, and he doesn't have slides of any of his shit. So I had to have him hold his books and take iPhone photos, so you can see his little thumb. So I really apologize for the rubbish images, but this time I'm going to go and see if I can get. But he, if you ask him, he's like, I don't know, where are they? It could be in this box, and there's a box there. Who's going to find these slides? Somebody needs to assist him, get a Mellon Foundation grant or something. So, these photos are from my iPhone, and here you see another grandmother. But to me, I'm also thinking grandmothers taking care of children is about the parents working all day and possibly many jobs. It happens in New York all the time for people who live in the Bronx and my students' parents all the time. And then, there's the grandmother trope, and then, but at the same time, he's not creating a fantasy of poor South Africans who all get together and are wonderful. He also shows this this lovely photograph of an Indian girl who's married to a young Zulu boy, and they have this child together. And I love this little decorative flounce on the top of the door. Because, when I was growing up, my parents are originally from Sri Lanka, and when you go back to the home country, people always put this decorative flounce on top of the entryway because it's just a welcome, It's not a privacy thing, but it's a way to say, I have a life of dreaming too. I'm poor, but it's a way to show that I also have decorative something in my life, as poor as I am. So I don't have a door, but I have this thing to signal something of welcome. But, again, I want to say that he's not trying to be all we are all in it together because we're poor. Because he also photographed this kind of stereotypical fat landlord. And behind him, you can't see it, but there are the two matriarchs of the family, and they're wearing the necklace that you get if you are Indian, and especially if you are of a very high class caste person, you get a giant golden necklace when you get married, and so they're wearing those. You can see that both of them have those necklaces, and then in the middle is some patriarch in a a formal suit, and that's the landlord. He's not there in it together with the poor people sharing his wealth. And then another one, I have to show you, these are pensioners coming to receive their pension. And the person who's running the show, where is he? Oh, I've missed it. But you know, like he's also one of these like, you know, stereotypical fat guy who's, you know, like the embodiment of the plenty. And in a way, you know, like if he's controlling the pension, his wealth in a way and his power came from controlling everybody. And then what he did was like, Omar, at one point before he started, he put a handgun on top of the table. And this handgun remained the whole time while pensions were being doled out. I mean, to these people, like, you know, these elderly people who come on crutches and stuff. But it's a symbolic thing, so nobody was going to really know it because he was already frightening and he had already built his persona as a gangster. But still, that gun was there. And Omar was in the, you know, like a fly on the wall taking these photographs. So I just want to, I'll conclude now and just say his work, along with that of his Afro-Pix contemporaries, refashioned South Africa in the global eye, for sure. And together with his passion for organizing and union work, photography became a strategy for intervention in how the South African struggle against apartheid was seen. He and his contemporaries left the traditional mandates of documentary photographers to stand apart and record impersonally. Instead, they began their journeys by positioning themselves first as political subjects who were part of the resistance. And so they didn't try to be like, oh no, I'm not part of this struggle, I'm outside. Because of that, they were able to gain access into the everyday workings of the anti-apartheid movement, to community meetings, to funerals of those who were killed by South African security defense forces, and to be witness to ordinary acts of resistance, endurance, and survival. At the core of the conversations that I've had with Badsha is his tenacious grip on political integrity and on directing the aesthetic, intellectual, and educative focus of his photographic projects, controlling that intellectual authorship and managing intentionality despite pressures that the international news organizations, local gallery owners, art dealers, and even one's own ambition to compete with one's friendly or not so friendly rivals in the world of South African photography is a daunting life project for any photographer. Certainly, challenging established apartheid tropes for art and photography and documenting the frame fabric of the national project had obvious risks. And Badsha's positions and steadfastness to the mission to which he committed himself as a photographer cost him in many ways, but his willful desire to record and to be witness to subsumed histories and to walk with his unapologetically political lens also maintained his integrity as a narrator of South African history. Thank you.